Okay, so we're going to do a few introductions. So welcome. This event is hosted by DamSense. DamSense is a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission of educating the public about the ecological, cultural, and economic benefits of a free-flowing Snake River, as well as communicating technical and scientific knowledge about dam breaching. Today we're covering a small topic we have not discussed before. That is how the lower Snake River dams impact the global climate. I'm going to be your facilitator. I'm Nina, she, her. I'm an outreach consultant for DamSense. I'm also a naturalist guide and ecologist by education, and I love communicating science so we can best protect the environment. Kirsten does social media for DamSense. She's our co-host. If anyone has technical difficulties during the presentation, please reach out to her in the chat. Okay, thanks for being here. So now I'm going to introduce our guest presenters, John Twa and Jim Waddell. Jim Waddell had a 35-year career with the Army Corps of Engineers. Within the Corps, he worked with EPA, NSF, and as the Senior Policy Analyst for the Environment in the White House Office of Science and Technology, pioneering the integration of climate change research programs so they could better inform national and international policy. From 1999 to 2002, he was the Deputy District Engineer for programs at Walla Walla, the district that oversees the Snake River dams. He started DamSense in his retirement and is currently a Public Utility Commissioner for Washington State. He is not representing his utility in any way at this event. Thanks for being here, Jim.
Thank you.
John Twa received a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Michigan Tech. In his career, he has worked for Chrysler Corporation, Sun Microsystems, Coviden, and PKG User Interface Solutions. He is a native to Michigan, but lives in Boise, Idaho. John believed hydroelectric dams were one of man's greatest achievements until he saw the film Damnation. He then learned about the reality of ecological destruction on the Snake River, and that motivated him to volunteer his time with DamSense. He first made an estimate of methane emissions from the lower Snake River dams in 2016, and has since updated his research. We are excited to hear about it. Thanks for being here, John.
Thanks.
So last thing before we dive into what we have prepared for you is a shout out to Patagonia Ballard for sponsoring this work. We would not be here if it wasn't for you. And so I'm gonna hand this over to Jim, who's gonna start with some slides.
All right, thanks, Nina. And folks, thanks for joining us at our first methane presentation. We've done some other presentations in the past on energy and so forth, and we hope to continue this as we go along. Our purpose is to educate and inform folks in terms of what government documents are saying about this, and that's what we're going to do today. The image you have in front of you is Lower Granite Dam under construction. And this is when the problem started. And because what we're doing here is blocking a free-flowing river and creating a reservoir behind it. And even in this construction photo, what is maybe not obvious, but the Snake River is already flooded from the downstream dam about 15 miles away. So that's not even a free-flowing river right there. That's already a reservoir. And then of course, this dam, when it was finished, blocked this stretch of water up 25 miles up into Lewiston, Idaho. And so the next slide, please, Nina. This gives you some, for those not familiar exactly where these dams are, they're circled there. There are 4 of them, and they're in eastern Washington. And it's important to realize in this discussion about methane is that part of the problem is what kind of water, what's in the water that's coming into these reservoirs. And you will note that the lower Snake River turns south and goes into southern Idaho and across southern Idaho. And for any of you folks that ever traveled Interstate 84, I believe it is, through southern Idaho, you will know that this is a very, very intensely developed agricultural area, cattle farming, feedlots, row crops, all kind of things that produce very, very high amounts of nitrogen. And John is going to get into that in a few minutes about what that means for all this. One thing about our presentation, it's going to be a little techy, and you guys will say, well, why are you giving us all this tech stuff? And why don't you just tell us what the conclusion is? We really need to do that because, next slide, please, Nina, there's a lot of statements being made about clean hydropower, clean energy and stuff like this. And what we want to point out is that you see some of these claims and you'll notice that they don't have citations and that kind of thing, other than Northwest River Partners said it or the Army Corps of Engineers says it. But these statements are stretches, they're overstatements, and they also do not reflect research that I started discovering around 2014 by really plowing through the internet looking for different things on methane emissions, because it's been well known for a long time, maybe 15 or so years or longer, that methane emissions from reservoirs in the southern hemisphere of this planet are a big issue. And that's because it's a lot hotter down there in most areas. And so the question was, well, what's going on in the northern hemisphere? And so the first thing I stumbled on was an actual report in 2014 that was basically very quiet about where the study was taking place and who was funding it. Well, it turns out with some little due diligence that the reservoir was the Corps of Engineers, and it was actually funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. But none of that was obvious at all in the report. But what this does tell us is the Corps of Engineers, at least, has known about these methane emissions in reservoirs for at least the last 6 or 7 years. There have been other studies that the Corps has been involved in fact, paid for some of the better ones that were done by some folks that you'll be seeing in citations later. And these, but anyway, so the Corps has known, but what has been a problem here is these reports have been largely kept off to the side. They're not being brought up by Bonneville Power Administration, and they're not being used by the Corps of Engineers like in Walla Walla or Portland to talk about what the real situation with methane. So that's what we're going to try to do here. And we're going to try to give you some of the technical stuff so that when you walk away, we're not going to give you a test at the end of this thing, but when you walk away, you'll know that DamnSense has really gotten into this, and some credentialed engineers have looked at the government data. And you can know with some confidence that when you say there's methane emissions and it's not insignificant, that you've got the backup. And we're going to be giving you a methane paper that we developed, or John did most of the work on. And this briefing, of course, is available. So the next slide, please. And this just shows you basically the start of, what the problem is here. Is this picture of the dam with the reservoir extending up 30 miles or so. And the reservoir is the problem here. We want to be clear, dams don't emit a methane, it's the reservoirs behind them. And there's very little discussion about reservoirs in all the studies and so forth, even with salmon recovery, because the government likes to look at, well, we're only responsible for the dam. And they tend to ignore what goes on in the reservoir, whether it's methane emissions or predator or temperature or whatever. So anyway, this just sets the stage. There's the problem we're going to deal with. So let me turn it over to Nina, and she will pick up a couple of slides next.
Thanks, Jim. So to really understand how methane is being released and why this clean energy label isn't appropriate, we have to look at a few biological processes. So the first one I'm going to talk about is eutrophication. And eutrophication is a process where the increase of nutrients in an aquatic environment stimulates the growth of algae. And a lot of people have heard the term algae bloom. That is a result of eutrophication. So you can see in the diagram that sunlight and nitrogen equals green water or algae growth. And so algae, their growth is really limited by the nutrients, like nitrogen. And so if there are a lot of nutrients in the system, there will be a large there will be a large amount of algae growing, or an algae bloom. If there are a small amount of nutrients entering the system, there's not going to be that much algae growing. So the amount of algae we have is really dependent on those nutrients like nitrogen. So the next process I'm going to talk about is decomposition. And decomposition is happening after the algae we just talked about finish their life cycle and die. And so they die, and then their bodies, that organic matter or biomass, actually falls through the water column, falls down, and rests on the bottom of the body of water. And so in the sediment is where decomposition is happening. And decomposition is a process where the breakdown of dead tissues makes simple organic compounds available again. So as you can see in the diagram on the right, we have dead algae as our input, as that organic matter. And then the decomposition process is performed by a number of different microbes that kind of pass off these different components of the organic matter. So there's 4 different microbes here doing the breakdown, and then the last one you'll see is called methanogens. And that is the microbe that takes these carbons from the algae and transforms them into methane gas. And so methane is one of the outputs of this decomposition process down there in the sediment. And so if we have CH4 coming off, that's the methane formula. And then that methane is then released. So I just want to give the chance to anyone who has questions about these 2 processes to write in the chat. And then next, we're going to put these 2 processes together to take a look at what the situation is in these reservoirs. And methane, I want to mention, is a greenhouse gas. Most of you are familiar with it. It is much more powerful, many times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And these are gases that trap heat in our atmosphere and contribute to the warming climate, what we know as global climate change. So the picture on this slide might be in a font that's too small to read, but I'll go through the whole thing. So this picture puts these 2 processes together. Eutrophication is happening here in this picture when we see these 2 arrows of woody debris and runoff from human activity. Those are the nutrient inputs that are coming into the reservoir. And then we see the algal bloom. And then those algae die, fall to the bottom, down to the sediment, and that's where decomposition is happening. And it says increased decomposing organic matter down there. And then we see all these bubbles that are rising up, that are methane gas or carbon dioxide. And this picture is from an article called Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Reservoir Water Surfaces, a New Global Synthesis. And they actually make the point that this situation of greenhouse gas release is worse in a reservoir than a natural lake. So what the caption reads is, reservoirs generate more methane and other greenhouse gases than natural lakes because they impound the flow of organic debris delivered by rivers upstream. Dams also tend to be built near people and related sources of nutrients that make impounded waters more productive, creating more for microbes to eat and generating more greenhouse gases. So what they mean here by impounding is that when you think about a reservoir versus a natural lake, The reservoir usually doesn't have a lot of vegetation surrounding it. It might have just concrete surrounding it. And so the flow of nutrients from the source to this water body is very direct. You're just getting, runoff coming directly from the streets of a nearby civilization right into a reservoir. And so that's what they mean by impounding. And so all these nutrients are collected in the reservoir, and that contributes to a pretty bad situation, a little worse than a natural lake that might have more vegetation surrounding it or be in a more natural setting. And so it's now that we know all this, it's time to change our idea of what clean energy is. And so again, if you have questions on these last few slides, just feel free to put them in the chat and I'll try to address them. And after this slide, I'm going to pass it over to John Twa, who's going to dive into the research being done on this topic.
Thanks, Nina. So back in 2016, when I first looked at methane emissions from the snake, there weren't really too many research papers out there directly related to the Pacific Northwest. There was one from Pacific Northwest National Lab from 2013, and that paper evaluated the 4 different pathways that greenhouse gas emissions can take to get into the atmosphere. One pathway is surface flux, which is just an exchange of dissolved gases between the water and the air. Another pathway is degassing through the turbines. There's a huge pressure change in the water, and it can force dissolved gases out of the water and allow them to be released into the atmosphere when they exit the turbine. Another way is hyporic flux, and that's actually where dissolved gases in the groundwater below the reservoir are being transferred into the surface water in the reservoir, and it escapes that way. And then the last pathway was ebullition, which is bubbling of gases in the sediment in the bottom of the reservoir up through the column of water where it reaches the atmosphere. And this particular paper looked at dammed stretches of the Columbia River, as well as undammed stretches. Undammed was the baseline, so that's basically a free-flowing river. Looked at what the emissions were, and they're very, very low. And then it also looked at one section of the Snake above Lower Monumental Dam. And one of the reasons there weren't many papers written on this is the first studies of reservoir emissions came out in 1993. So this is kind of a relatively new study area. The second paper we looked at was the Biosciences article from 2016. The title of that one was Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Reservoir Water Surfaces, a New Global Synthesis. And that paper was actually written by Bridget Deemer and John Harrison at Washington State University. And it looked at 261 reservoirs, most of which were in North America. The point of that article was to try to find the best predictor of high methane emissions. What aspects of a reservoir would show that it was going to be have high methane emissions? And it looked at several variables: reservoir age, reservoir latitude, reservoir temperature, the amount of nutrients in the reservoir. And then it also looked at the chlorophyll A concentration. Chlorophyll is the green pigment in algae. And that was actually found to be the best indicator of high methane emissions. So I wrote the paper in 2016. Then in 2017, Pacific Northwest National Lab wrote another paper that specifically focused on this ebullition, or the bubbling of methane out of the sediment. Another paper we recently looked at what the bubble knows, lake methane dynamics revealed by sediment gas bubble composition. And that really looked at the chemistry and biology of methane in the water. Next slide,
John,
please.
before I go to the next slide, we have a question in the chat. It's a clarifying question from Liam, and he's asking if the gases that I just talked about in the reservoir causes bubble trauma to salmon. So Liam, the short answer is no. Carbon dioxide and methane release is not related to bubble trauma in salmon. From what I know, bubble trauma in salmon is from the oversaturation of oxygen in the water. And so that is related to dams, but unfortunately we will not get into that topic today. But hopefully we'll have a chance to do that in future presentations. So I'm gonna pass it back to John for the next slide.
Okay. So study method examples. When looking at the biosciences article, they had taken these chlorophyll A measurements and correlated them to methane emissions. And we're wondering, has anybody done chlorophyll A measurements in the snake? And actually the Army Corps has. They measured the chlorophyll A concentrations in the 2002 Lower Snake River Juvenile Salmon Migration Feasibility Report and Environmental Impact Statement. When they took those measurements, in 13 of 19 locations and years that they took measurements, the reservoir fell into the eutrophic state, which is great for algae production. The phosphorus and the nitrogen levels also indicated that the reservoirs were in a eutrophic state. In the 2017 article from Pacific Northwest National Lab, they really focused on that ebullition pathway because the results from their 2013 study were very startling to them. They hadn't imagined that there was so much methane coming out of these reservoirs. And again, they actually took measurements from Lower Monumental Reservoir, which is part of the Snake River. Next slide, please. This is a graphical representation of what's occurring. You've got the organic matter-rich bottom layer. You've got methane bubbling out of it. There's algae that are living and dying and ending up in that bottom layer. And you've got the microbes there that are consuming that dead material and actually producing the methane. The way that they measure the methane is they have these cone-shaped funnels that they sit on the surface in various locations in the reservoir, and the methane bubbles up and ends up in these cones, and then they can actually take a measurement of how many milligrams of methane are coming out over a certain area at over a certain amount of time. They found that the emissions were greatest in shallow water, which is less than 30 feet deep or 10 meters. Those would be considered littoral areas, which is lake-like. And also water that was low velocity, less than 1 foot per second. The Snake River dams or the reservoirs in the summer do slow down to less than 1 foot per second starting in June. Another thing that was found is that warm water was best for algae growth. Temperatures above 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of these conditions don't exist in a free-flowing river. Velocities are too high, rivers are colder, and so the algae growth just doesn't happen in the same quantities that it does in a slow-moving reservoir. And that explained the difference between the high methane emissions in the dam portions of the Columbia and the undammed portions. Next slide, please. So results and conclusions. as far as the total methane emissions, ebullition made up 97% of the methane emissions in the Columbia and the Snake. And the rate at which it was coming out ranged from 7.5 milligrams of methane per square meter per day, all the way up to 984 milligrams per square meter per day. And the mean daily value was 521. And this number is consistent with other high methane producing reservoirs around the world. This really surprised the researchers because the Snake River is considered a xeric or dry river or region, and it's not tropical. Normally, these levels of emissions are only found in tropical reservoirs. Next slide, please. So what we tried to do is take this rate of methane emissions and convert it into a yearly value. How many metric tons are actually coming out? We were able to calculate the surface area, the number of meters squared, and that's less than 30 feet deep. And we got that info from the Army Corps of Engineers. They calculated that number in their 1992 drawdown test, where they actually lowered the reservoir down. And that equates to 10,415 acres for the 4 reservoirs. And it's 30% of the reservoirs are less than 30 feet deep. And then as far as the number of days where algae growth was optimal, we looked at how many days per year were above 62 degrees. This is water temperature as measured by the Army Corps. And then where the velocity of the river was also less than 1 foot per second. And we came up with 113 days that met that that criteria. It's between June and September, October. And so when we did the calculation, we came up with 86,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent methane emissions. Methane has a higher global warming potential than CO2, so you have to multiply the methane emissions by a number, and we use a global warming potential of 34. The EPA says that the number should be between 28 and 36. So our number was good. Next slide, please.
John, I just want to jump in really quick.
Okay.
And just note that I put the link to your study that's cited on this slide in the chat, just to make it really simple for people to find it, because it does only appear on the DamSense website. So if people have time to download it now, they can just go back and reference it whenever they want.
Okay. So what? What is 86,000 metric tons? What does that mean? How do we put that in perspective? Well, it's definitely not zero. And that's what we've been told for decades, that these are carbon-free sources of energy, and they're really not. To put things in perspective, there's a gas-fired natural gas plant in Washington called Ecogen, and it puts out 165 megawatts of power on average, and it emits 96,000 metric tons of CO2 per year. So these reservoirs are almost equivalent to that. And this is in addition to the other negative effects that these reservoirs have on the ecosystem. There's plenty more. Next slide, please.
John, Jim
Yeah.
here. Something interesting came out yesterday that also puts this in perspective. Governor Inslee released his bold climate action plan. And what's really interesting is one of the things they're going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is electrify the ferry system in Washington. And this is going to cost the state of Washington $190 million to do this. And it's interesting because each ferry that they electrify reduces carbon by 16,000 tons. Now think about this. A bold action plan that's going to spend $190 million to reduce 16,000 tons on each ferry. Let's say they do 4 or 5 of the big ones. That's still not even close to what you can do by breaching the lower snake dams and knocking off 87,000 metric tons. So that just came out yesterday. So this is another thing that tells you how skewed this idea about carbon-free hydropower and and so forth has become. And so we'll talk more about that at the end, though.
Okay. So how do these methane emissions play into climate change? We've got a vicious circle going on here. As temperatures warm because of climate change, the river temperature, it's staying above 62 degrees longer, which means there's a longer growing season for algae, which means more methane can be created, which then causes climate change and increases temperatures, and around we go. From 1960 to 2015, the average temp in the Snake River has gone up 1.4 degrees. And the average number of days per year that they're above 62 degrees has increased 7% just from 2016 to 2019. Right now we're at like 113 days per year. Next slide, please. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recognizes that hydropower dams and reservoirs are emitting methane, and these numbers could be substantial. And they're looking at including them in each country's inventory of methane producing plants. Right now, just plants that are burning fossil fuels are counted in those inventories. So they're talking about adding reservoirs. And this could be significant for Washington. There's over 1,100 dams in Washington. So there's a considerable number of square feet of reservoir or acres of reservoirs emitting methane in Washington alone. Next slide. Actually, turn it over to Nina now.
Thanks, John. I have this slide in here about rivers and the carbon cycle, because with these dams in place, the climate is affected not only because they are releasing methane, but also because of the dam's effect on the carbon cycle. So there's a picture here on the slide that kind of is an overview of the carbon cycle. There's a certain amount of carbon on our planet, and that number doesn't change, but carbon gets recycled, transformed, and moved all around the planet. The picture highlights some of the ways that carbon is moved around. The river's role in the carbon cycle is really the transport of carbon to the ocean. So you can see that carbon is coming from rock erosion, from the mountains and stream banks, and then also coming from living things that have died or are still alive, plant and soil erosion. And so all that material is entering the river, and then it is being transferred to the ocean. And there are two complex words there, biogenic carbon and petrogenic carbon that come into the ocean. That just means carbon that comes from living things versus carbon that comes from non-living things like rocks. And so there was an article I found that that said the world's rivers transport 200 million tons of carbon to the ocean annually. And when that carbon reaches the ocean, it accumulates at the bottom in the sediments. And that is where carbon is stored over the long term on our planet. And those sediments over a long period of time become, they get pressurized, and then they might wind up in a couple billion years as mountains again. But the ocean is where carbon is stored for that long period of time. It's where carbon is sequestered, or there is a carbon sink. So that carbon that's stored won't be put into the atmosphere. So it's all about, mitigating climate change is all about taking that carbon out of the atmosphere, or keeping carbon that could get to the atmosphere away from the atmosphere. So rivers play a role, free-flowing rivers play a really important role in this. And so when there is a dam on a river, it blocks that natural cycle of carbon reaching the ocean. And so the next slide, I'm going to talk about benefits that free-flowing rivers have on climate besides the carbon cycle. So I really thought about this as, okay, what we have now is rivers with dams on them, but what would the benefits to climate be if these rivers were free-flowing again? Of course, they would participate in the carbon cycle again, but there would be all these other benefits to the climate. So if on a restored river where dams were removed, there would be an increase of sediment transfer, which mitigates the effects of floods and droughts. There would be an increase in the prevalence of natural habitats, such as wetlands and forests, where more carbon is stored in the soil. And so that's thinking about the concrete turning into a forest, and a forest is a short-term storage for carbon. A restored watershed would increase population diversity, abundance, and habitat connectivity, making species more resilient to environmental stress driven by climate change. And kind of overall, a good way to think about this is right now, the system is a positive carbon feedback loop. And what I mean by positive feedback loop is that carbon is being added to the atmosphere right now consistently. And so that can turn, with dam removal and river restoration, that can turn into a negative feedback loop where carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere and stored. And so we really have an opportunity to go from this climate change perpetuating system to a system that actually helps mitigate climate change. And we can also expect that these benefits will increase as time goes on, because as the restoration process progresses, more and more carbon will be stored in this watershed. So for long-term ecosystem health, there's a huge benefit, and that benefits the climate. So I just want to give people another chance to ask any questions if they have, and I'm going to pass it back over to Jim Waddell, who's going to wrap up our presentation.
Okay, thanks, Nina. So, some concluding points, and let me just start off with, a term here. We see clean and we can see sustainable, but this term carbon-free has been used on these dams, for 20 years, I guess, or ever since there was discussion about, oh, we've got to get away from coal and fossils. Absolutely true. But to say that, our hydro system is a critical answer to that because it's carbon free. Well, okay, but it's not greenhouse gas free. And I think this is a subtle, but dangerous nuance here, is that for years we've been, telling the world and telling ourselves that they're carbon free. And when we knew all along, using different terminologies like methane or, algae or chlorophyll, as John pointed out, the Corps of Engineers 2002 study that I worked on. And I remember talking about chlorophyll, but, we didn't use, it wasn't in the context of climate change at that point in time, or the dams weren't being used as a, the solution to turning off coal plants at that time. Anyway, here we are today. So what do we got? We got what's clear now, these dams should not be considered green or sustainable, not only because of what we just described in terms of methane emissions, but also obviously obvious other things in terms of what they're doing to salmon and in the failure to provide sustainable habitat for salmon. And also as Nina just pointed out, that breaching also helps with these ecological system-wide effects in terms of the ecosystem and moving sediments around. Well, let's see, what else we got here? I mentioned, there's one more bullet, I believe, Nina. It's just this, is that when we talk about specifically the Snake River dams, the people groups often pull one issue out and say, well, that's not a reason to breach the dams. And, maybe not. Maybe if it was just about this 165 megawatts equivalent of carbon from similar to a plant, or whether this is, you're going to do it by electrifying ferries at 17,000 megawatts a piece, where you got 87,000 here. But what you have to keep in mind is that put it all together. And this is just another damning bit of evidence, sorry, the pun, that points out that these particular 4 dams are costing us a lot of money. They're emitting methane. That's going to have, and they cost a lot of money to operate because they're aging hydro, and they're killing salmon and other species and so forth. And so when you add it all up, you say, why on earth would we continue to be doing this in terms of, continue to operate these dams in the face of all this overwhelming evidence? But it's rarely put together that way. And that's what we try, endlessly to do that here with the folks, the volunteers and staff that we have here with the Dam Sense team, is to put all these things together. So keep that in mind. And in the last chart, as people say, well, what do I do? Can I help? Can I get involved? Yes.
Before we go to the last slide, I just had a comment from John, who brought up a really good point to me. Will watershed restoration help prevent wildfires in Idaho? And I don't know if you want to jump in on this, John, because you know about the wildfire issue more than I, but that's something that I didn't include on that slide, was wildfire mitigation. With a healthy forest and a restored watershed, that would reduce the prevalence of wildfire, and that would reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases from wildfires. So it's kind of like all these ripple effects of benefits. And I bet there are even more climate benefits to a restored watershed besides the ones that we've mentioned. So thanks for bringing that wildfire point up, John.
Okay, so thanks, Nina, for pointing that out.
Okay,
so
here's the last slide.
Our last slide, and you notice we don't have a test here, so that's fine, but we would ask you to, do what we ask. Reading, the public doesn't do enough reading, and I know there's a ton of stuff out there, and that's why we're trying to help here, is to bring these remote, buried documents, government reports to the surface and try to sum them up for you. We're also asking that our elected leaders, like Governor Inslee just released this climate thing, and they still don't recognize, even though we've been trying to tell them for years, that these reservoirs emit methane. And And the thing is, if we're going to keep our hydro system, as you know, the rest of it intact and usable, because we really need these other dams. They're unquestionably important, not only for power generation, but for irrigation and flood control on the main stem Columbia. And so what we need to do, though, is make sure that people like Governor Inslee and even the White House is you know, the President-elect Biden is already kind of moving off with this hydropower might be a solution to climate change. And it is in some cases, but if you have underperforming dams that have reservoirs behind them that are emitting methane, that's just suboptimizing the other system. You're wasting money there, but you're also adding to climate change, or I mean, climate warming. And so it asks that you share this knowledge and, you know, in terms of what we're saying about methane in general and what the impact, you know, what the Lower Snake dams is just one more issue that points to the reason why we need to talk about breaching these dams immediately. And oh, by the way, I'm a Corps of Engineer guy, worked policy for many years. And one of the things that you will always get kicked back with the minute you breach this is, oh, this takes years and years and years because we got to get congressional authorization and all this kind of stuff. And that's simply not true. If the Corps of Engineers was directed either by the White House or pressured by Governor Inslee or Senator Murray or Cantwell, they could turn this around in a matter of months. In fact, breaching, because it's already well developed from an engineering standpoint, and we understand exactly how to do it. It's well covered in a document, a plan the Corps did, and it's what they call a shovel-ready project. And so this is one of the kind of things that creates a lot of jobs after breaching, but even during breaching, it'll create jobs as well. And we would hope that the administration and Governor Inslee might appreciate this, but they don't even realize we have this opportunity because they've been told for so long that it's not an available option. So let's
thanks, Jim. I'm gonna jump in here. Thanks for that last point. That is really important because we shouldn't stop our advocacy just because we think that this problem is gonna take forever. But we definitely could have a whole nother presentation just about breaching. So we are gonna keep the topic to climate impacts, and we're gonna take question and answers now. So I've already got some questions. If we are not able to answer your question today, please email it to info@damsense.org. And so the first question is from Heather Nicholson, and then I have a follow-up question. And I think John might be the best person to answer this, but Heather's asking, what are the chances that the Lower Snake River dams actually emit more than the estimated amount of greenhouse gases that you calculated, John?
I think our estimate was pretty conservative, and they probably are emitting more. We only looked at days when water temperature was over 62 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the optimal condition, but they're still producing methane at temperatures below that, and we didn't even put those in our calculation. So I think our estimate was very conservative, and yeah, there's a very good chance that emissions are higher than that.
Thanks. So this is a follow-up question from Rosemary. So she's asking, are there methane monitors along the river to confirm your estimate? What would it take to confirm actual emissions?
That's what scientists are trying to figure out right now, because they might have to include these in the inventories. Those Pacific Northwest National Lab studies were commissioned by the Department of Energy so that they can try to figure out how this is going to be done. To my knowledge, there are no permanent monitors of methane on the river. These were just, monitoring that they set up specifically for their paper. And then when they were done, they took them out. So I mean, governments around the world have to figure out how to do this. Right now, they don't know. But that's where a lot of research is being done.
Thanks. So I have a question here. Just looking through here. This is actually a legal question, so I'm not sure how well we can answer it. This is from Shannon. So I don't know, maybe Jim, you can speak to this, but is there a way to use climate change as a litigation strategy for dam removal?
There probably is, but what you want to keep in mind is any litigation strategy is decades long, particularly probably as it relates to climate change. And so, and to put this in perspective, the Lower Snake River dams have been in litigation for over 25, 30 years. And anybody who's been following this is probably, half of them are dead now, but litigation is just an unnecessary route to dealing with this issue, because the policy approach that we have outlined that is based on core policy and the way the authorizations work and so forth is that this really doesn't need to be done with litigation. It can be done with a policy decision by the Corps of Engineers, and they can turn that around in a matter of months.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Jim. So we have a comment here from Greg Fitz. It's not exactly a question, but I like to facilitate discussion. So Jim or John, you might have something to add to this, but he's saying we need environmentalists to move away from goals of 100% renewable power. All of those plans require expansion of hydro. So do you have a response to that?
Yeah, hydropower, like I said in the presentation, in the Pacific Northwest is an essential component of our baseload power. There's no doubt about that. And where that important power is in dams like Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph, the Lower Columbia dams, and so forth. It's not these dams. And so what we're trying to point out is that these particular dams, they're on a low flow river that during the peak period of demand, they have very little flow and therefore very little power to put out. And so, and as it regards to renewables, there's so much surplus right now in the system, in Bonneville's system, that you don't even need to replace these dams with anything. All you have to do is reduce your surplus that you're shipping most of to California, and at a loss most of the time. So, but in terms of renewables coming on, I think that it's important to realize that they are a way of lowering the overall cost of energy for ratepayers, because, and no, they're not 24/7 power, but neither are most dams, unless they're big storage dams like Grand Coulee. Snake River dams are not storage dams. Yeah, they got a reservoir behind them, but they're run of river. That means the water coming in has got to go out. And so they're like wind or solar, is like they're limited to their water flows. Now, they're a little bit more predictable than wind or solar, but still it's not an either or situation. It's not renewables, all renewables are going to replace all hydro. That's certainly not the case. We also have to remember that a lot of our hydro, even 30 or 40 years from now, maybe we'll have some magic technologies that say, well, we don't need the hydropower, but we still need those dams because they're providing irrigation to big chunk of Washington state. And on the Lower Columbia, they're providing navigation that's beneficial and flood control in the upper reaches. But the Snake River dams are not flood control or your dams. So that's how I would, address that comment. Thanks.
Awesome. So I'm getting some questions about energy, and they are really important questions. But I do want to keep the topic on climate I want to say that we have a presentation on our website that we recorded, and it's on YouTube, called Understanding Energy. So that talks about the differences between the Snake River dams and the other dams in the Federal Columbia hydro system. But there is a question here talking about, our activism. We are all members of electric utilities or electric cooperatives. And so a question from Susan is, with this information from today, how can we, what influence can us as members of these utilities have to push a dam removal for the Snake?
Nita, was that a question?
Yeah, so it is a question. It's what influence can we have as utility members? And I do want to keep this topic to climate. There is, a lot on energy and how the dams are underperforming, but how can we reach out to these utilities and co-ops about this, about climate and how the dams impact climate?
Yeah, actually, that is a good question, and it's an important one, because what people can do, everybody's getting electricity from some utility, a public utility district, a co-op, or a city utility. Most of them, from what I've seen and experienced, over the years, is that they, in the state of Washington especially, there's this belief that the hydropower is clean, carbon-free energy, and therefore is immune from any discussion about, decommissioning any of this hydropower, like on the Lower Snake dams. But what the leadership, the elected officials, the commissioners and so forth, board of directors or whatever at these utilities, they need to hear from the public. They need to hear this message that you just saw today, and you can do that. In almost all cases, these utilities or districts or whatever have monthly or bi-weekly meetings that's open to the public and open to public comment. And so I would encourage people to go to your power provider and make these comments, or submit a little note saying, why aren't you telling us about the methane emissions from these reservoirs and what the consequences are in terms of impact. So that's a great way to approach that, is go directly to your PUD commissioners or co-op board directors or whatever they call it.
Awesome, thanks, Jim. So we have a question from Liam. Does Inslee's plan, his new state climate plan, include any kind of reference to the methane issue? I think I can answer this. It doesn't. It does talk about reducing carbon emissions, but it doesn't say anything about hydropower. So, and I guess, Jim, you can talk more to that, since you read the plan. Jim, are you there? Well, Jim doesn't seem to be here at the moment, but Liam, I bet if you just go to Governor Inslee's website, I think that plan will be like front and center, because it just came out yesterday. So it's very easy to read too. It's
hey, Nina, I
yeah.
didn't catch your question a minute ago.
It was about Inslee's new climate plan.
Yeah, I scanned it really quickly, and I noticed the business about the ferries, where, for $190 million, we can reduce 17,000 megawatts per ferry. And all I was pointing out there is it's really remarkable that the state's willing to spend 190 million to reduce a much smaller amount of carbon equivalent than it would by decommissioning the Snake River dams. And decommissioning the Snake River dams doesn't cost the state of Washington a dime. And so that's one of the things we ought to be telling the governor is that, hey, why aren't you paying attention to the methane emissions and what they're doing and getting the feds and Bonneville Power Administration to do the right thing there?
Yeah, I don't think carbon emissions from hydropower reservoirs are even on Inslee's radar. So reaching out to him about this, is just the beginning of what he might do to help the situation. Heather Nicholson just mentioned that submitting letters to utilities puts your letter on the record. And that's another great way to have an influence is writing letters. So yeah, your utility does have an address, and so you can send letters to them too. And so we actually have quite a bit of time, but I don't see any other questions. I do want to mention that we did record this, and we are going to be putting it on YouTube. But we also have another live presentation of the same slides happening tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And so if you learned something or you want to share this with someone who is interested, please do. We've reached out to a lot of politicians to invite them to learn about this, but it really helps if the public reaches out to folks that may not know that hydropower is not carbon free. So help us spread the word about the event tomorrow and just this knowledge in general. And we are having another event in January, a workshop if you want to be more actively involved in making public comments. I'm going to be running that workshop. So keep that in mind. And here we have one more question here that came up. And this is one for John Twa. John, have you heard of the cyanobacteria producing methane study? Cyanobacteria occurs ubiquitously. I'm not sure if you know anything about the study of cyanobacteria producing methane.
I do not. Please send it to us. We'll take a look.
Yeah, I don't either. The bacteria that do produce methane, they need an anoxic environment, so they can't have any oxygen. That's to exist. So I'm not sure if there are cyanobacteria that exist in a zero oxygen environment, they might be able to produce methane. So that's interesting. Yeah, please follow up with us about that.
Nina, I'd like to point out that on the screen on the left, it is damsense.org website address. And since some of the questions were talking about the other aspects of the dams and reservoirs that we weren't intending to try to cover in this, the damsense.org website has a ton of information about all the different issues covering these dams and the reservoirs, whether it's economic development in the Lower Snake Valley after breaching, or hydropower issues, BPA's financial situation, navigation issues on the Snake River Dam, on the Lower Snake River, which, oh, by the way, is not really an issue because all grain shipments can be completely serviced by rail shipments that are rail lines that are already there. So a lot of this stuff, I would encourage you, if you haven't been to damsense.org, take a look. We even got poetry there. We've got movies. We've got all kind of stuff that I think people that are seriously looking at, what what our credentials are in terms of what we are presenting and how we're presenting it in terms of government documents is sort of our cardinal rule. It's the gold standard for us in terms of we're not going to be out there saying anything or drawing any conclusions unless we can point you to a government source, data, document, report, or something that supports what we're saying. And then when you go to look at other people who are making statements, ask them that question. What is your source? What is your citation? Why are you saying this? And that goes for any group, whether they're pro-dam or pro-breach. Always look for that. What is the truth here? What is the source of this information? Because that's what's killing us. Is there's a lot of government data out there that actually supports the conclusion that these dams, A, should never been built in the first place, and B, they need to be breached immediately. And there's a way to do that immediately. But none of that's getting out because most of the stuff that's being said is said without any kind of citation or documentation to back it up.
Thanks, Jim. We really appreciate your input and your passion on this issue. Since we have no more questions, I'm going to wrap it up. Heather, I've written down this article on cyanobacteria, so I'm going to check that out. Liam asked, when is the workshop that I'm doing about using your voice and making public comment, and that I believe is on the 18th, but you will probably get an email, and it'll be posted on Facebook if you follow us on Facebook, and Instagram if you follow Dam Sense on Instagram. Thank you so much everyone for taking the time to come and learn about this topic. I hope we are able to continue doing this. Happy holidays if you celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. And we hope to see you at one of our next events.